It's amazing how often those light bulb moments, those breakthroughs, they don't really come out of thin air. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like you dig a little deeper into how any major innovation came about, and there's almost always this backstory.
Yeah.
It's connected to something that already existed,
Uh-huh.
maybe in a totally different field even,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
or it was just waiting for the right pieces to click into place.
Exactly.
So, welcome to the deep dive.
Glad to be here.
You guys sent in a really eclectic mix of sources this time.
Yeah.
Everything from like the grand sweep of evolution
Oh,
to the nuts and bolts of scientific discoveries and how new tech actually gains traction.
that's quite a range.
So our mission today,
Okay.
to go through all of this material and see if we can tease out the underlying patterns,
Yeah.
the things that really seem to drive the emergence of truly good ideas.
You know, one thing that jumps out at me right away going through all this is this idea that
Yeah.
innovation, it's not this limitless anything goes phenomenon.
No.
It's actually, I think it's more constrained by where we're at currently,
Okay.
by the existing state of things.
Right.
And Stuart Kaufman, he calls this the adjacent possible.
The adjacent possible, so like a shadow future of sorts?
Yes, sort of.
Of innovations that we could get to, but only from where we are right now.
Exactly.
Not like an infinite universe of possibilities,
Right.
but more like a well-defined set of next steps based on what's already in play.
Hmm.
It makes me think about those early stages of life,
Yeah.
like that primordial soup, all those molecules bumping around.
Yeah.
And there were only so many ways they could actually interact.
Uh-huh.
Like you couldn't just go from that to a complex cell with all its specialized parts.
No.
The adjacent possible back then only allowed for those simpler chemical reactions.
Hmm.
But those reactions were still crucial.
Of course.
They were the foundation for everything that came after.
And there are some really good evolutionary examples of this in the sources, too.
Oh, yeah, like what?
Well, like that semilinate carpal bone that velociraptors had.
Oh, yeah, I remember reading about that.
Initially, it just gave them better grip for hunting, but
Yeah.
millions of years later,
Yeah.
it became a key pre-adaptation for flight in birds.
Wow.
Or even the development of opposable thumbs.
Oh, yeah, good one.
Suddenly, tool manipulation, that whole new world, opens up as the next step.
It's like evolution constantly testing the boundaries of what it can achieve
Yeah.
with the tools it already has.
Exactly.
And it makes you think maybe we should be focusing on those smaller evolutions too,
Hmm.
not just those giant revolutionary leaps forward.
Right.
Like what seemingly small changes could unlock a whole cascade of new possibilities.
And, you know, another example from the early Earth,
Yeah.
the formation of those dual-layered membranes in early cells,
Uh,
that was another crucial step
why is that?
because it paved the way for more intricate internal structures,
Oh, they see.
like the nucleus and the mitochondria.
So it's like each step sets the stage for the next set of possibilities,
Yeah.
which is kind of the opposite of how we often approach things as humans.
How so?
Well, we're always trying to break barriers, shatter those limitations.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
But even then, even when we're being super inventive, the adjacent possible, it still seems to influence us.
It does. And Charles Babbage's story with the analytical engine
Oh, yeah, that's a great example.
really highlights that.
For those who haven't heard of it, it's essentially the first computer
Yeah, designed way back in the 19th century.
by this incredibly forward-thinking guy.
But his vision, it was kind of ahead of its time.
In what way?
Well, the sources point out that the necessary parts, the manufacturing capabilities,
Yeah.
they just weren't there yet.
They weren't advanced enough to make his complex design really work reliably.
Exactly.
He was envisioning this information age machine in the middle of the steam-powered era.
Right.
And it took
Yeah.
another century for the world to catch up, for his ideas to really take off.
It's incredible when you think about it.
It really is, and it makes you wonder what brilliant concepts we might be playing with now
Yeah,
that are just waiting for their own enabling technologies to emerge.
that's a great point.
So the adjacent possible,
Yeah.
it defines the playing field.
Oh, okay.
But what about the actual spark, the thing that ignites those winning moves within that space?
Right.
Our sources, they really push back against those simplistic light bulb moment cliches.
Yeah,
They paint a much more interconnected picture.
that's for sure.
This idea of a good idea being this singular flash of insight.
Yeah.
It doesn't really hold up when you look closer.
Instead, your sources describe it as a network.
A network.
Yeah, a novel configuration of neurons firing in sync within your brain.
So it's not just one single neuron, it's a whole bunch of them working together.
Exactly. It's like this temporary alignment within the complex web of your mind, exploring the potential within your own internal adjacent possible.
That's a cool way to think about it.
And we know that routine tasks, those engage neural networks, but creative breakthroughs, those seem to involve different network patterns.
Like a different kind of signature.
Right, a more novel pattern of communication between neurons.
So how do we encourage those innovative networks to form in our brains?
Well, what's interesting is that the answer, it seems to mirror the nature of the problem itself.
Okay.
To cultivate innovation, you need to immerse yourself in environments that have that same network characteristic.
So like dense webs of interconnected ideas.
Yeah, and this is key: interconnected people.
People too. So it's not just about the ideas themselves, it's about the interactions between people.
Exactly. And some settings, they just naturally prime our brains to make those new associations.
And this idea of connection being important,
Yeah.
it goes way back even before brains even evolved.
Oh, wow.
Our sources talk about the origin of life itself
Right.
and the fundamental role of connectivity in that whole process.
Give me an example.
Like carbon atoms in the primordial soup. Carbon can bond with all these other elements. And the dynamic, unpredictable environment of liquid water.
Yeah.
It allowed those elements to constantly collide and interact.
I see.
And that was crucial for the emergence of the first building blocks of life.
So it's that interplay between connectivity and a certain degree of randomness.
Yeah, that seems to be a recurring theme when it comes to new things coming into being.
It makes me think of Arthur Koestler's act of creation.
Oh, yeah. How so?
Well, his analysis of individual creativity, it's definitely insightful.
Ah,
But I think your sources, they suggest that maybe it doesn't fully account for
yeah.
the influence of these external
The
environments.
environments in which those creative acts take place.
Exactly. Koestler focuses mostly on the internal aha moment
Right.
inside the individual's mind.
But our sources, they emphasize that those minds,
Yeah.
they're always embedded in broader networks.
The networks that provide them with information, challenges, inspiration.
Even the city itself can be seen as this powerful engine of creativity.
Because it's this dense network of individuals and all their different ideas.
All right.
And Dunbar's research on lab meetings,
Oh, yeah. What about it?
it really brings this home.
How so?
Even in a cutting-edge molecular biology lab, it wasn't always the fanciest tech that sparked the best ideas.
Really?
It was a group of people just sitting around a table talking.
That's so interesting. Why do you think that is?
Well, what's so valuable about that setting is that it creates what we could call a liquid network.
A liquid network.
Yeah, ideas can flow freely between projects. Assumptions get questioned and challenged.
Right.
And those productive analogies, they have a better chance of emerging in conversation.
Than when someone's just thinking on their own.
Exactly.
So you've got the adjacent possible defining the realm of what's potential.
Okay.
And these liquid networks helping foster the connections that lead to new ideas.
Yeah,
But sometimes those connections, they take a while to solidify, right?
that's true.
Which brings us to the concept of the slow hunch.
The slow hunch, it's this idea that doesn't just pop into your head fully formed. It emerges gradually over time.
Like a seed that slowly germinates.
Yeah, it's more like a persistent feeling, a hunch that needs to connect with something else to fully develop.
That makes me think of the Phoenix Memo.
Oh, right, the one filed by Ken Williams before 9/11.
Exactly. He had this growing concern about terrorists using flight schools.
It was a provocative idea, but it was incomplete.
Right.
And it needed to connect with another hunch.
Which was?
The situation with Zacharias Moussaoui in Minnesota.
That was about a month later, right?
Yeah, both of those were huge red flags.
But they were treated as separate issues.
And because of the FBI's kind of closed information network.
What do you mean closed?
Well, it was very siloed. Information didn't flow freely between departments.
What's that called again?
The stovepipe mentality.
Stovepipe mentality.
And because of that, those two pieces of the puzzle, they never came together.
Wow.
And that really highlights what can happen when those connections fail to happen.
And it makes you wonder about the systems we have in place now. Are we really doing a good job of encouraging those connections?
It's a good question.
Now contrast that with the story of StoryRank.
Which eventually became Google News.
Right.
In that case, they had this organizational culture that encouraged exploration.
They gave people space and resources to develop those half-baked ideas.
Exactly. And Krishna Farhat, he had this hunch about a better way to organize news.
And that hunch eventually turned into a valuable tool.
Yeah, a tool for connecting related stories.
And that's exactly the kind of system that could have potentially linked the Phoenix memo
To the Moussaoui situation.
Wow.
So nurturing a slow hunch, it's not about intense singular focus.
It's more about consistent cultivation.
Yeah, giving those hunches the space and time to make connections.
And think about Joseph Priestley.
The scientist.
Yeah. He had this slow hunch about plant respiration that lasted for decades.
Wow.
But he didn't just obsess over that one question.
He kept himself busy.
He explored all sorts of scientific avenues, did tons of experiments, had wide-ranging conversations.
So he essentially kept that hunch alive in the background.
Yeah, letting it make connections across all these different areas.
And this reminds me of the historical practice of keeping commonplace books.
Commonplace books.
Yeah, like John Locke and Erasmus Darwin, they use them.
What are they?
They're these personal notebooks where you jot down interesting observations, quotes, ideas, anything that catches your attention.
Hmm.
And it wasn't just about memorization, it was about revisiting those thoughts later.
Letting them bump up against each other in unexpected ways.
Exactly. And the key was to avoid being too rigid with your categories.
You wanted to encourage that cross-pollination of ideas.
Right? Because new ideas, they rarely thrive in isolation.
And we see this with Tim Berners-Lee and the World Wide Web.
Oh yeah, he spent a decade developing that.
And he was lucky enough to be working at CERN,
Which had a pretty flexible environment.
where he could pursue his ideas alongside his regular work.
And importantly, he was also connecting with other hypertext pioneers online.
So that combination of dedicated space and external connections was key.
For sure.
So those slow hunches, they need time and a connected environment to really blossom.
But sometimes those critical connections, they happen more spontaneously.
Through serendipity.
Serendipity, the power of accidental connections.
Right, and your sources have some amazing examples of this.
Like what?
Well, Otto Loewy's famous dream that led to his Nobel Prize-winning experiment.
The one about chemical neurotransmission.
Yeah, that's a classic example of serendipity.
But it's interesting because it wasn't completely out of the blue.
Right, he had been thinking about that problem for 17 years.
So the dream was like the culmination of all that thinking.
Exactly, it was the unexpected but inevitable result.
Kind of like Friedrich August Kekule's dream of the Ouroboros.
The snake eating its own tail.
Yeah, that gave him the visual metaphor he needed.
To figure out the ring structure of benzene. Again, a seemingly unrelated image connecting with a long-standing scientific problem.
And your sources, they actually delve into the neuroscience of this.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they suggest that our brains, they need to cycle between different states,
Right.
like periods of structured activity, what they call phase locking,
Wow.
and more chaotic exploratory states filled with neural noise.
So it's like our brains need some quiet time to organize everything.
Yeah, and then they need some chaotic time to shake things up and make new connections.
And during those chaotic times,
Yeah.
it's like our brains are experimenting with new connections that wouldn't normally form.
Exactly.
There's even a study by Thatcher that suggests
What's that?
that a certain amount of neural disorganization might be linked to intelligence.
Wow, so a little bit of chaos is actually a good thing.
It seems that way.
Like, our brains need to wander off the beaten path to make those unexpected discoveries.
And you know, Henri Poincaré, the mathematician?
Yeah.
He talked about how his biggest breakthroughs,
Yeah.
they often came when he wasn't actively working on a problem.
Like when he was taking a walk or something?
Oh, exactly. It's like his mind needed that freedom to roam.
To let those half-formed ideas collide and combine.
So how can we cultivate more serendipity in our own lives?
Well, your sources suggest exposing ourselves to a lot of new information.
Like Bill Gates is reading Vacations.
Yeah, where he spends a week just reading about all sorts of different things.
It's like a way to compress information intake.
And hopefully spark some unexpected connections.
And then there's this idea of collaborative serendipity.
Where technology can help us.
Oh, really?
Yeah, like with software tools like DevonThink.
With that?
It can analyze your notes and find connections you might have missed.
Like unexpected but relevant connections.
Exactly.
Give me an example.
Well, someone used it to find a link between Victorian sewage systems and the evolution of bones.
Oh, that's pretty random.
But it's also a great example of algorithmic serendipity.
It's fascinating that your sources also talk about the decline of serendipity.
Oh, yeah, because
Yeah.
of the internet and all that.
But they argue that the web might actually offer more opportunities for accidental discovery
Really?
than traditional media like libraries and newspapers.
How so?
Well, think about it. The web is this giant interconnected network of information.
With hyperlinks connecting everything?
Exactly. And there's just so much content out there.
Yeah, you can stumble upon pretty much anything.
And Ethan Zuckerman, he did this study comparing the New York Times website to the print edition.
Oh, yeah.
And he found way more potential pathways for discovery online.
Interesting.
So while search engines can help us focus,
yeah.
even those curious what's the deal with that searches,
Mm-hmm.
they can lead us down some interesting rabbit holes.
So it seems like serendipity, it favors the prepared mind.
A mind that's open to making those unexpected connections.
Right.
Okay, let's switch gears a bit
Sure.
and talk about what happens when things don't go as planned.
Okay.
Your sources, they offer some interesting perspectives on the role of error in innovation.
You know, we're often taught to see error as a bad thing.
Something to avoid at all costs.
Right.
But these sources, they make a compelling case that error can actually drive innovation.
Interesting.
Think about Lee DeForest and the invention of the Audion tube.
Didn't he get a lot of things wrong at first?
He did. He completely misunderstood how his device worked.
Really?
He thought the gas flame inside was detecting electromagnetic waves.
Which wasn't right at all.
But his experiments with that flawed understanding,
Yeah.
they led him to invent something truly revolutionary.
That paved the way for radio and television.
It's like being wrong forced him to explore new paths he wouldn't have otherwise.
I see.
And Nemeth's research on group discussions.
Oh, yeah. What about it?
It suggests that introducing a little bit of noise or even misinformation
Into the discussion?
can actually lead to more creative thinking.
So a little bit of dissent can be a good thing.
That's what her research shows.
Why do you think that is?
Well, it seems like those dissenting voices, even when they're wrong, they force the other people in the group to re-examine their own assumptions.
So it pushes them outside their comfort zone.
Exactly. And it challenges this idea that accuracy and consensus are always the best path to progress. It's kind of like the role of error in evolution.
Oh, so?
Well, DNA mutations, they're essentially errors in the genetic code.
Right.
Most of them are neutral or harmful.
Uh-huh.
But every once in a while,
Yeah.
a random error opens up a whole new range of possibilities.
For adaptation and new traits.
Exactly.
So too much error would be bad, but a little bit of background noise.
It keeps things dynamic.
It provides the raw material for those evolutionary leaps.
And the water flea,
Oh, yeah. They can switch between sexual and asexual reproduction.
which is a cool example of how life balances the need for accuracy
With the benefits of introducing variation.
through error. So
Yeah.
it seems like environments that are good for innovation,
Yeah.
they're not necessarily error-free.
Right. It's more about embracing those useful mistakes as opportunities to learn and explore new directions.
Okay, let's move on to the concept of exaptation.
Exaptation, it's this idea that something that evolved or was developed for one purpose,
Yeah,
it gets repurposed for something completely different.
like bird feathers.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They originally evolved for insulation.
And then they became crucial for flight,
And this repurposing, it happens all the time in technology and culture, too.
like Gutenberg's printing press.
That was a great example of exaptation.
He took the technology of the wine press.
And used it for mass communication.
It was brilliant.
And then there's Jacquard's punch cards.
Those were originally for controlling looms, right?
Yeah, but Babbage used them in his analytical engine.
And the Audion tube.
First for amplifying radio signals.
But it also ended up being used in hydrogen bombs in early computers.
Even something like Nike's Green Exchange.
What's that?
It's an initiative that connects companies with waste streams.
So they can find new uses for those waste products.
Exactly.
It's like commercial exaptation.
And the World Wide Web itself is a great example.
How so?
It started as a platform for academic research,
Right.
but it's been repurposed for all sorts of things.
Online shopping, social
Right.
media, streaming video, you name it.
And even the hyperlink.
Oh yeah, what about it?
Brin and Page, they used it to create the foundation of PageRank.
And it's not just physical tools either.
Right. There are also these rhetorical or figurative exaptations.
What are those?
Well, it's when concepts from one domain are used as metaphors in another.
Give me an example.
Like Francis Crick, he compared DNA replication to a sculptor making a statue.
Interesting.
Or Johannes Kepler, he used religious metaphors to explain planetary motion.
Oh, wow.
And even the desktop metaphor that we use for computers.
Yeah, that revolutionized how we interact with them.
And Kekule's dream of the Ouroboros.
That was a structural formula and a powerful metaphor.
Exactly.
And Claude Fisher's research on subcultures in cities.
Yeah.
That's another example of environmental exaptation. The density and diversity of cities, they create this fertile ground for niche communities and innovation.
And Mark Granovetter's strength of weak ties argument.
What's that about?
Well, he says our weaker social connections.
The people we don't know as well?
Yeah, they're often more valuable for accessing new information.
Because they bridge different idea spaces.
Exactly like Gutenberg and the Vintners.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Those weak ties gave him the technology he needed for the printing press.
And even Watson and Crick's coffee breaks.
Yeah.
Those fostered weak ties between scientists with different perspectives.
It's interesting how even a company like Apple,
which is known for being very secretive.
yeah, they seem to foster internal exaptation.
How so?
Well, their product development process,
Yeah.
it encourages this clash and connection of different ideas.
To prevent revolutionary ideas from being watered down.
So they've created this environment where internal exaptation can thrive.
That's fascinating.
Okay, so we've talked about how innovation often builds upon existing foundations.
Whether it's biological traits or technologies.
And this brings us to the concept of platforms.
Platforms, they're like the building blocks of innovation.
Okay.
New ideas and technologies, they're often built upon existing ones.
Creating these layers of increasing complexity.
Like Darwin's theory of atoll formation.
Oh yeah, those ring-shaped coral reefs?
He saw them as an emergent behavior, the
Yeah.
complex system of the atoll.
Uh-huh.
It emerged from the simple actions of all those individual coral polyps,
Working together.
and all building upon the platform of that subsiding volcano.
It's amazing how simple actions can lead to complex structures.
And your sources, they talk about ecosystem engineers.
What are those?
They're organisms that change their environment,
In ways that create new opportunities for other species.
and sometimes in really unexpected ways.
Like with Gear and Weifenbach and the accidental tracking of Sputnik,
That led to the development of GPS.
which is a great example of an emergent platform.
They set out to track a satellite.
And they ended up laying the groundwork for a technology with countless applications.
And we see this stacking of platforms everywhere.
Like where?
Well, in the arts, with the evolution of creative genres,
Uh-huh.
and in the digital world,
Like Twitter building on SMS, GPS, and internet protocols.
and the ability to build upon open platforms without permission,
That seems to be a huge driver of innovation.
because it lowers the barriers to entry.
And the DC Apps for Democracy contest,
That showed how much innovation can happen.
when developers can build on existing open data.
And platforms, they often have this appetite for things that other people see as trash.
Trash.
Yeah, waste abandoned goods, things like that.
Give me an example.
Well, old subway cars being used to create artificial reefs.
Oh yeah, I've heard of that.
Or how innovative businesses often thrive in older, cheaper urban spaces.
Like Jane Jacobs talked about.
And even nutrient recycling in coral reefs.
How's that a platform?
Well, it's a system where waste products become valuable resources.
Supporting the whole ecosystem.
And Brent Constance,
Leibniz.
he took the coral growth mechanism and used it to develop bone cement.
Wow.
And then he applied that knowledge to create green cement.
So a slow hunch connected with new understanding.
And led to the creation of a potentially transformative platform.
It's amazing how even something as simple as Twitter's 140-character limit,
Yeah.
it relies on so many layers of platforms.
Many of which were developed for completely different purposes.
That finally your sources talk about this fourth quadrant of innovation.
The fourth quadrant, it's a different way of thinking about innovation.
Different from what?
Well, it's different from traditional models.
Like a market competition.
Yeah, or solitary invention or state-controlled research.
Okay.
The fourth quadrant, it's all about open networks, collaboration, sharing ideas.
Like in modern research universities.
Exactly.
And the rewards are different too.
In what way?
Well, in the private sector, it's all about patents and profits.
Right.
But in academia, it's more about recognition and advancing knowledge. And the focus is on the free flow of information.
And your sources, they argue that a lot of intellectual achievement, it's happened in these more informal open spaces.
Like graduate seminars.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or coffee houses or online communities.
And even Darwin, whose theories are sometimes seen as supporting ruthless competition.
He actually recognized the importance of collaboration.
And Thomas Jefferson, he wrote about this in 1813.
What did he say?
Well, he was talking about patent disputes.
Uh-huh.
And he basically said that the free flow of ideas is more natural.
Than the artificial scarcity created by intellectual property law.
So the fourth quadrant, it reminds us that there are many ways to foster innovation.
and that open networks and collaboration are really important.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the fascinating world of good ideas,
Yeah,
we've covered a lot of ground.
we have.
The adjacent possible liquid networks, slow hunches, serendipity error acceptation platforms, and the fourth quadrant.
It's all connected.
In understanding these patterns, it can help us create environments
And habits.
that are more conducive to generating good ideas.
So here's a question for you, our listener.
Okay.
How can you introduce more noise into your life?
More randomness, more unexpected encounters
Yeah, or connect with more diverse idea spaces.
to spark those new insights.
And think about the platforms you use every day.
Yeah.
Could you use them in ways you haven't thought of before?
That's something to ponder.
Thanks for joining us.
Until next time.
Bye. Yeah.